Is there an echo? I'm just doing that for Herb. He's at home hearing an echo. That's just me, Herb. I'm messing with you. There was an echo earlier this morning, so I just couldn't resist. I'm sorry. I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart. Where? Down in my heart. Where? Down in my heart. I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart. Down in my heart to stay. And you know, there's a chorus to that some people don't know, and it goes, and I'm so happy. And I'm so happy, so very happy, I've got the love of Jesus in my heart. Can you tell that I believe? I'm a firm believer in teaching in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. And then there's, I've got the peace that passeth understanding down in my heart. And then there's a lesser known verse to this because it's the one that we as kids love because it had so many syllables in it. I've got the wonderful love of my blessed Redeemer way down in the depth of my heart. You know, and the wonderful love of my blessed Redeemer way down in the depth of my heart. Some of you might be saying, hey, that's a children's song. And you know what? It is a children's song. And we are God's children. And as you start to look at this Last Supper discourse, Jesus' Last Supper discourse that's here, and of course that being the Last Supper before his crucifixion. And this morning as we look at this, I like to place it starting in John chapter 13 and verse 31. And as we go through this, Jesus begins to explain his departure. And there's some things that we're going to see this morning. One is that the way he sees us as little children, that's going to come up in this. We are his little children. And we're going to see, I hope anyways, the wonderful love of our blessed Redeemer and what we're supposed to do with that love. We're going to see the peace that passeth understanding. And we're going to see the joy that's supposed to be in our hearts. And these are the things that we can be happy about. Jesus begins to explain his departure. This is an interesting thing because the men that he had been with, they've grown to know him and have a relationship with him. And now it's time for him to explain his departure. And you start with the hour of glory, really, in chapter 13, verses 31 through 33. He says, therefore, when he had gone out, Jesus said, now. And he uses the word, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him immediately. And the Son of Man glorified now and immediately. The situation where Jesus is leaving these disciples, has another little caveat in it, and it is that they can't follow him. So he's not only going to leave them, but he's saying, you can't follow me. And when I read through this, I start to think of a child, and you know, dad's going off, and he's looking at him, and he's saying, where I'm going, you can't come right now. You know, but later on, I'm coming back. And there's some things that pop up because where he goes, he's going to go someplace, and he's going to bring them back to a place that he went off to prepare. It's not a permanent thing, but can you imagine having to talk to your little children about this? And so it is with tenderness in verse 33 that Jesus says, little children, I am with you a little while longer. You will seek me, and as I said to the Jews, now I also say to you, where I'm going, you cannot come. Now, the Apostle John uses this phrase, little children, in one of his epistles too, in the epistle 1 John. In chapter 3, verse 18, listen to what he says. He says, little children, let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and truth. And in chapter 5:21, little children, guard yourselves from idols. And in chapter 2 and verse 28, little children, abide in him so that when he appears, we may have confidence. And in chapter 4, verse 4, you are from God, little children, and have overcome them because greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. We need to have the blessed Redeemer way down in the depth of our heart. So let me ask, what do you say to these little children of your Jesus? He says, I'm going to give you something. As Jesus looks at these little children, he says, I'm going to give you something. He goes, I'm going to give you a new commandment. Now, I grew up hearing the word commandment, and the commandment, I command you, you took commands very serious. The 10 Commandments. And Jesus is saying, I'm going to give you a new commandment. And that new commandment, we already know, we looked at this a couple of weeks ago, actually, that you love one another, even as I have loved you. Jesus wants us to love the way that he loves. He wants us, God's little children, to have the wonderful love that the blessed Redeemer has. The wonderful love of the blessed Redeemer is what we're supposed to be about. He wants us to do this and have love for one another. And not only that, but it becomes the mark of a Christian. We live in a bumper sticker society where you see, I'm a disciple of Christ on a bumper sticker. Jesus is the rock and I'm on the roll. And there's all sorts of symbols, even athletes point to heaven when this thing happens. And there's all sorts of identifiers that people want to let others know that I am a disciple. But, Jesus says this is how all men are going to know that you're my disciples. If you have love for one another. That's how he's going to know. And so as we look through this in the class this morning, let's start in chapter 14 and notice the things that Jesus says. And I was looking at this and looking at this, like, no, you're kidding me. And I told Adam and Brian, how do you all do this? Because this is a pretty, well, there's a lot packed into these chapters here. But notice this tenderness of Jesus in verse 1 of chapter 14. Do not let your heart be troubled. And so here's a question for everybody that worships here. Has your heart been troubled lately? Do not let your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. He doesn't want us to be troubled. He wants us to believe in God. He wants us, you know what this is? This is trust. Do you all understand what a local congregation is? A local church is a group of people that have decided to trust each other because they trust the one who's way down in the depth of their heart, the blessed Redeemer. And that's what we're looking for. It is a matter of trust. That word believe, you can't believe if you don't trust something. And he wants us to do that. I love John chapter 3, verse 16. That simple statement, God so loved the world. There's the love. And then he talks about the trust, that whoever believes. And do we really believe this outrageous story about God coming to earth and dying? And as Jesus is sitting there before these people explaining that he's going to go away, this becomes something that he wants to let them know. And he's talking to them like they're little children. Do not be troubled. Do not be troubled. The idea of the Son of God going to the cross is terrifying, and this would cause many people to stumble and to be troubled in their hearts. Oh, I didn't advance to the next slide. By the way, I don't have PowerPoint. It just didn't happen. This would have caused many people to stumble in their hearts. And Jesus is telling them, I want you all to trust me on this. And that first commandment, that new commandment, he wants us to trust him on that. Now, that's going to take some work on our part. He wants us to trust in that as well. John also wrote in 1 John chapter 3, verse 16, he says, we know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. And that's that kind of love he's talking about. We ought to be willing to lay down our lives for each other, for the brethren. Jesus doesn't want your heart to be troubled, and he's giving you practical, spiritual, godly advice from the wonderful Redeemer. And in chapter 16, verse 33, which is the very last verse in this section that we're studying, he says, these things I have spoken to you so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation. Again, is anyone feeling some tribulation? And you know what he tells them? He says, but take courage, I have overcome the world. There's really nothing in this world that's not already been conquered. And we shouldn't let the world conquer us. And we shouldn't let our hearts be troubled by the things that go on in this world. I think sometimes we're afraid of the wrong things. There are things to be afraid of. But when you walk with Jesus, as these men did, and when you are disciples of Christ, and when you have love for one another, he's giving us practical advice to not have these kind of fears and how to get through this. Do not let your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. There's that trust in verse 1. I will not leave you, he says in verse 18. This is another thing. He doesn't want you to think you're going to be left alone. In verse 18, he says, I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. So if you're feeling all alone and you feel like, what's happened, he says, I'm not leaving you. I'm not going to leave you as orphans. You won't be alone. There's more to your life. I wish that Philippians 4:7 was in this passage. I've got the peace that passeth understanding. But the concept's there too. And I'm just going to go through some of these concepts. Peace in chapters 14 and 16. In verse 27, we see peace I leave you with you. My peace I give to you, not as the world gives, do I give to you. Do not let your heart be troubled, nor let it be fearful. And he speaks about this peace in chapter 16, verse 33, which we read, that you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage. Jesus wants us to have joy in chapter 15, verse 11. These things I have spoken to you so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be made full. And in chapter 16, verse 20, he says, truly, truly, I say to you, that you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will grieve, but your grief will be turned into what? What does he say our grief's going to be turned into? Joy. Let me turn into joy. And he uses the example of a woman. Whenever a woman is in labor, she has pain because her hour has come. But when she gives birth to the child, she no longer remembers the anguish because of the joy that a child has been born into the world. Therefore, you too have grief now, but I will see you again, and your heart will rejoice, and no one will take your joy away from you. Imagine again, this is his departure speech. He's saying, nobody's going to take this away from you. He's letting them know that I don't want you to have tribulation. I want you to have joy. I want you to have the peace that passes understanding. I want you to have all these things. Jesus doesn't want us to be troubled. He wants us to have peace. He wants us to have joy. And in verse 24 of chapter 16, he says, until now, you have not asked for nothing in my name. Ask and you will receive, so that your joy may be full. May be made full is actually what it says. So that your joy may be made full. Which brings up another discussion that comes out of these chapters. Jesus wants us to ask. In chapter 14 and verse 13, he says, whatever you ask in my name, that will I do, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask me anything in my name, I will do it. And then in verse 16 of that same chapter, he says, I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper, that he may be with you forever. So we have Jesus telling us to ask, and then we have an example of Jesus actually asking. In other words, he's practicing what he's recommending. He's saying, you all should ask. And then he turns around and he does what? He asks. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. Chapter 15, verse 7. My Father is glorified by this. So God is glorified by us asking. Is that as simple as it is? And we're going to open this up in a second. Whatever you ask or whatever you wish, it will be done for you. And my Father is glorified by this in verse 8 of chapter 15. But look what else he says. That you bear much fruit. And so prove to be my disciples. I think there's a hint in here about what kinds of things we should be asking God for. It's easy for Jesus to say whatever you ask whenever you've got the love of the blessed Redeemer in your heart the way that he's defining it. You have to take all of this together. He's giving us some things, and they're all in there. It all works. He says in verse 16 of chapter 15, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you, that you would go and bear fruit, and that your fruit would remain, so that whatever you ask of the Father in my name, may he give to you. And I think that kind of lets us know, okay, we have a part in this. We're supposed to be bearing much fruit. We're supposed to be doing, what do you think that looks like, that fruit? Any ideas from the class? What do you think, how do we bear fruit? What do you call that, Brian? Crickets? Chirp, chirp. Adam?
Well, the first thing I think of is, of course, Jesus is saying this to the apostles first. I mean, in the context, that's who he's talking to, so that's who it applies to initially, and then secondarily, we can take the principles and apply them to us. But what did it mean for them? I mean, he was literally going to give them the Great Commission to go into all the world and preach the gospel of all creation. The fruit of that is obvious. Many souls brought to Christ. That's one fruit. Even though we can't control that outcome, but that is one fruit, is being a light and affecting the lives of others.
Okay. Being a light and affecting, let's just make it a little simpler for me to wrap my head around it. Is it's definitely something spiritual here. You know, he's not talking about something that just has no regard for God. There's a relationship that I think that we need to take with all of this together. Also, I don't know how I feel completely about this was given to the disciples. I think that's absolutely true contextually. But we want to be careful where we make those lines and those divisions, because there's so much in here that we all agree with is applicable to us. And I'm not going to, I thought about this in this class, I'm not going to draw where I think it ducks in and out, because I don't have that kind of information at my disposal yet. I take it all pretty serious. I look at, even whenever John ends his prayer, that I have many more things to say to you, but I'm going to wait to see you face to face. Sometimes when I read that, I say, that's what God's saying to me. God has many more things to say to me, but he's going to wait on some of this. And I have a tendency to say, all of this is for my benefit. And it's more than just a book of things that happen. And when I read something like this, that your fruit would remain, so that whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he may give to you. We have this other concept here of asking in God's name. Well, there are some things that God's going to say no to. I'm going to circle back around to this, because if you think about it, Jesus said, your will be done. And what happened to him? He died on a cross. Be careful what you pray for. And it's not always what we think. Jesus wasn't given a bunch of material things on this earth. That's not what happened at all. And yet he talks about joy and the things and the love and all the stuff that he passes on. In chapter 16, verse 23, he says, in that day you will not question me about anything. Truly, truly, I say to you, if you ask the Father for anything in my name, he will give it to you. Until now, you have asked, and this is rather interesting, until now you have asked for nothing in my name. I think this is really important, where we pick back up with what Adam was saying. These disciples hadn't asked anything in his name yet. And it makes you start to think, well, what does that look like, asking for something in the name of Jesus? He says, ask and you will receive, so that your joy may be made full. When you look at the lives of these men, they didn't have the best of life all the time, but they had joy that was full. I think that their goals and their ambitions are a little differently maybe than sometimes the way I look at life. And then in verse 26, he says, in that day you will ask in my name, and I do not say to you that I will request of the Father on your behalf, for the Father himself loves you, because you have loved me and have believed that I came forth from the Father. Jesus did ask for a lot of things, and I think the prayer's coming up. Is it Wednesday, Adam? Or I think it's Wednesday. When are we doing John 17? I think Wednesday. Yeah, so there's things that are coming up that are going to deal with, we're going to see Jesus asking for things for them. But the Father knows what's going on, and notice that he says that it's about this love. The Father himself loves you because you have loved me. And once again, this relationship starts to come through. All right, the next thing, I got to move on. I spent too much time on that. I have spoken was another phrase that kind of pops out. In chapter 14, verse 25, these things I have spoken to you while abiding with you. But the Helper, the Holy Spirit from the Father, will send in my name. He will teach you all the things and bring to your remembrance all that I said to you. And again, I have this picture of a father going, I'm not abandoning you. I'm not walking away from you. I'm going to send a helper. You're not going to be here by yourself. And you're not going to be doing this all on your own. And there's a reason why I've been speaking to you and telling you the things that I've told you in the past and the things that I'm telling you right now. He's trying to build some confidence. He's trying to comfort them with his departure. And then in chapter 15, verse 3, you are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. So we know that he's speaking, that God's word is able to cleanse us, and it's important that we listen to this. And then in chapter 15, verse 11, these things I have spoken to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be made full. So one of the reasons why he spoke these things is so we would have the joy, joy, joy down in our hearts and the wonderful love of our blessed Redeemer and the peace that passeth understanding. In chapter 16, verse 1, he says, these things I have spoken to you so that you may be kept from stumbling. So the things and the advice that he's giving in these chapters is to keep us from stumbling. And in verse 4, but these things I have spoken to you so that when their hour comes, you may remember that I told you of them. These things I did not say to you at the beginning because I was with you. He's letting them know that some of the things I said to you because I'm here right now. Some of the things I didn't say, is going to be spoken later, and I'm going to send somebody to speak to you. And then he says, but now I'm going to him who sent me, and none of you ask me, where are you going? But because I have said these things to you, sorrow has filled your heart. And so we start to see where these little children are. They are little children whose hearts are filled with sorrow, and Jesus is trying to give them the things that they need before departure. He sees their sorrow. There's a lot of tenderness that's said in these verses. There's a lot of hard truths that are said in here. But I think you see some compassion coming from Jesus because of the sorrow that had filled their heart. And in verse 25, he says, these things I have spoken to you in figurative language. An hour is coming, though, when I will no longer speak to you in figurative language, but will tell you plainly of the Father. And of course, we already read the verse that chapter 16 ends on. These things I have spoken to you so that in me you may have peace. In the world, you don't get that. You get tribulation instead. All right. The other one I wanted to pull out, where we're going to spend probably the rest of our time, is love. A new commandment that I give to you, that you love one another even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Chapter 14, verse 15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Chapter 14, verse 21, he who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him, and I will disclose myself to him. Chapter 14, verse 23, Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and he will come to him and make our abode with him. He who does not love me does not keep my words, and the word which you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me. Chapter 14, verse 28, you heard that I said to you, I go away, and I will come to you. If you loved me, you would rejoice, because I go to the Father, for the Father is greater than I. Chapter 14, verse 31, but so that the world may know that I love the Father, I do exactly, and here's this example setting again, I do exactly as the Father commanded me. Get up, let us go from here. And in chapter 15, verse 9, just as the Father has loved me, I have also loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. Chapter 15, verse 12, this is my commandment. You think that Jesus is trying to get a new commandment across to us? And whenever he says, if you keep my commandments, as you read through this, what commandments do you think Jesus is really interested in us keeping? I mean, he keeps saying it over and over. It has been my experience that the things that God says over and over and over and over, we should pay attention to, a special attention. He's not just saying them multiple times. Some things are said more than other things. What do you think is one of the most talked about subjects in the Bible? Let me rephrase it. What does everything hinge on?
Heaven.
Huh?
Heaven.
Oh, okay, heaven. Adam?
Love.
Love. Okay, yeah, Adam. Love. The whole law hinges on this concept. It is, and we need to pay attention to it. And as you're reading through this chapter, this is the thing that sticks out at me in this discourse more than anything else, is how many times he talks about this commandment. Chapter 15, verse 17, this I command you that you love one another. I didn't finish 12, and starting in verse 13, he says, greater love has no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. No longer do I call you slaves, for the slave does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends, for all things that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. He has made this one point known, that the commandment is that you love one another, even the way that I have loved. He wants us to keep that commandment. It is a hard thing to do, to love your brethren, because we're all different. But God does this. We are to love. I used to kind of think, well, you can, you have to love everybody, but you don't have to like everybody. And somebody pointed out to me that just doesn't really work, that you can't separate those two things. That's not what he's asking. He's asking for us to love each other the way that he loves. And when you start to look at Jesus and what he does, that turns a corner. Now, I'm going to tell you, I think there's a lot of bravery and hero-type ideas that run in our brotherhood. I think a lot of brethren would take a bullet for me. I really do. I'd jump and take the bullet. If I saw it coming, I would jump in. And a lot of brethren will do that. They'll take the bullet. They'll die for you in that way. He speaks about this idea of greater love has no one than this, than one laid down his life for his friends. But I want you to think how Jesus does that. Ultimately, we all get the easy part. The easy part is, for us, is that he died on a cross. That's quite a sacrifice. He dies on a cross for something that he didn't do wrong. All right, I got that one. But before that happened, he gave up his life. He lived in the throne room. He was exactly where he belonged. The God of heaven sitting there, in the throne room with the Son. They're exactly where they belong, and you know who's on this planet, this cursed planet? All the people that belong here. He gave all of that up. He took on flesh, and he came to a place that he did not belong, a cursed planet. He gave up that life that he had to come and suffer on the cursed planet. And I think sometimes we fast forward to the end, but when he came here is when this really started, what he gave up. God's looking for more than us to jump in the way of somebody dying or to save somebody by giving them an organ or something like that. He's looking for us to give up our life that we think we deserve. There's a very much a less and less and less of it's about me, it's about me, it's about me, and more so that it's about you and about you and about you, the way I would look at people. I can't afford to say that that guy really gets under my skin. That person at church, they just irritate me. That's not what God wanted. That's not what Jesus did. Jesus looks at it and he says, and listen, you got to understand that this is a tough thing. I'm teaching the class to myself, but that's what he wants from us. to love the way that Jesus loved would encompass those kind of ideas. He also says that you have heard that I said to you, I go away and I will come to you. If you love me, you would rejoice, because I go to the Father, for the Father is greater than I. But so that the world may know that I love the Father, I do exactly as the Father commanded me. And then in verse 9 of chapter 15, he says, just as the Father has loved me, I have also loved you. Abide in him. And as he continues through this, one more time in verse 17, this I command you, that you love one another. If you were of the world would love its own, but because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, because of this, the world hates you. And this is another one of those verses where it becomes rather evident that, first and foremost, he's talking to the disciples here, in the context of this. And I think about those men, that the world would hate them. The world did hate them and were kind of cruel to those men. And I think it was going to be important that they loved each other. How are they going to get through the trials? I mean, it's going to seem at times that the whole world's against them. I don't know how well they got along, but we did see some feuding and fighting along the way to this point, didn't we? Who's going to be first in the kingdom? I mean, there was rivalry amongst this group, and Jesus is telling them, I need you all to love each other the way I love each of you. That's what I want you to do. I want you to see each other in a different way, in a different light. There was something they were going to be doing together, which I think is something we are supposed to be doing together, and that is teaching a lost world. And in order to do that and to reach the lost, we're going to have to take on some of these concepts. So when people from the world come in here, what are they going to see? Well, the first thing they need to see is how much we love each other. It's always a comforting thought when people tell us that. We've had people say, the thing about your congregation, you could tell that the people there loved each other. And that's good. That's good. And then he says, in that day you will ask in my name, and he says, and I do not say to you that I will request of the Father on your behalf, for the Father himself, he loves you, because you have loved me, and I have believed. So let's dig in just a little bit more. Do you think loving your brethren is difficult or burdensome sometime? Have you ever been inconvenienced by a brother and felt like, we had the privilege of taking care of Ann's dad for several years in our house. I'll be honest with you, there were times when I'm going, I don't like this. And Ann and I would remind each other that, well, that's what love looks like. You're not always doing what you like. I'm going to love this person as long as I'm having fun or I'm getting something out of it. Sometimes life isn't that way. Was Jesus having fun when he was hanging on the cross, dying for you? His love wasn't dependent upon that. If a brother or sister gets under your skin, let me give you a suggestion. Pray for them. The reason why it's hard to pray for somebody in private and it not change the way you look at them, you won't feel ill towards them when you see them, and it will help you with that. Some might object at Jesus calling this a new commandment and say, Jesus, that's not a new commandment. The Bible's been telling us to love our neighbor as ourselves for a long time in Leviticus 19 and 18. But careful if you listen to this the correct way. Instead of as yourself, it is as I have loved you. There is a difference between loving somebody as you love yourself and loving somebody the way that Jesus loved. Which one do you think is harder to do? And which one do you think has a little more depth to it? So there is more depth in this statement that's said. We see this when Jesus washed the disciples' feet. He sets a standard for how we are to treat each other. If you go back to the Old Testament, it's not totally lost there. In books like Leviticus, in chapter 11, chapter 19, chapter 20, chapter 26, this idea of be holy, for I am holy. We've always been asked to be imitators of our God. So we come back to the same question, though. What's new about this commandment? Well, it's the standard of love. The cross becomes the standard. Before Jesus, the exhortation to love as he loves is really not as clear as it becomes on the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep, and greater love has no one than to lay down their life. We already mentioned that it's a mark of a disciple. There should be an emphasis on this, though. If we were baptized into the one true non-denominational church of Christ, and if we take the Lord's Supper on Sundays, and if we don't use mechanical instruments in worship, and if you take the correct view in things like marriage and divorce and remarriage, and we put an emphasis on needing to be baptized, is that the mark of the one true church? We put a lot of emphasis on things like baptism. How long you think I could start teaching something like, oh, you don't have to be baptized to be saved? How long do you think it would take Herb to get over here if I said that, from his house to say, we're not going to allow that to be taught here? We need to put just as much emphasis on this. This idea of loving one another the way that Jesus loves. Because I'm going to tell you what, God put more emphasis on it. He really did. It permeates the scriptures. If you're looking for something that God said over and over and over, he wanted us to love the way that he loves. Jesus didn't call all those other things the mark, so we want to keep in mind where that is. This is a commandment that demands some sort of adherence that we're passionate about. I've heard a lot of arguments over things with a lot of passion. Since I've worshiped here, I've heard this too. I've heard Herb and Adam and Brian and many others have passionate conversations about this concept of loving the way that Jesus loved. If we have love for one another like Jesus describes, it won't just be so that all others know that we are his disciples. It will be so that we know that too. We need to know that. And this is going to help us do that. If you're uncertain, I can tell you this is where you start. How does love practically demonstrate itself in a congregation of God's people? Well, spending time to get to know the brethren. Church does not end at the final amen. It's amen. That's not how that works. Part of the reason for the assembly is so that we can stimulate and encourage one another towards love and good works. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 and 25. Another thing you can do is strive to help the brethren in need. And this is a very generous congregation. Don't be stingy. Show hospitality. Have people into your home. Romans 12, verse 13, Hebrews 13, and verse 2. Visit the sick and the shut-in, the depressed, the downtrodden, the widows, the orphans, Matthew 25 and 36. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep, Romans 12, 15. Conflicts are going to happen, but they should always be resolved. There should not be gossip. And reconciliation actually takes priority, over worship. God wants his people to be reconciled to him before they become devoted to him in some way. He wants the reconciliation first. We can go through the motions of worship. You can be doing a lot of things that are things that God has asked us to do. But this is a commandment that he's asked us to do as well. We need to have that same passion. All right. So I have this other thing, and it just says mansions. And I wanted to talk about this briefly. There was so much in here, I didn't know what to pick at times. And I started looking at mansions, so I left it in here at the end. As Jesus is talking to these men, he tells them that he's going away. And he says, in my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. Well, in the King James Bible, they use the word mansion. And the word that's used there is mane in the Greek, and it just simply means dwelling place. And if you look in chapter 14, verse 23, we see the word again. And in verse 23, it says, Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our abode with him. And this is the idea here. A dwelling place, an abode with our Father. The picture that Jesus is painting is not this huge street of Beverly Hills mansions. And I think the King James idea of a mansion kind of put this in our head over a long time. There's been songs written about it with this idea of a house, and it's almost to the point where, you've got this house, and it's this gold and silver, and the archangel comes over and has dinner every now and then. Which that's not the picture Jesus is painting. Notice that we are not living by ourselves in big houses, but rather we are all living together in one house. Do you see why Jesus might want us to follow that new commandment, to love each other the way that he loves? Because the people that are coming into this house, they're going to need this. We're all going to. Have you ever lived in a crowded situation with a lot of people? Have you ever lived in a crowded situation or vacation with people that aren't in your family, they don't cook the same food, they don't think the same things, they don't like the same activities, and you get into these situations. What's going to get you through that is going to be something higher than what I want. And Jesus tells them, if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. In a way, it's a mansion because the Father and the Son are going to be there. I mean, do you really need any more? That's pretty spectacular right there. Jesus goes to prepare a place and will return again so that they can be together. So what does it mean when Jesus says he's going to prepare a place? Is he talking about the final place prepared for us in the new heavens and the new earth? Is he talking about the place prepared for us within the church, the New Testament people of God? Is he talking about both? Jesus' departure may refer to the cross. But as I look out here this morning, there's one thing I have never seen physically, is Jesus sitting amongst us. I've seen these things and read about them knowing that he's here, but I don't see his face. He is absent from our present. And there is a sense in which we dwell in the house of God now, but there is more to come. There's a sense in which we are going to be with him in this place that he's gone to prepare. The fact that I don't see him physically tells me something else. It tells me that he's still preparing for us. And I also like something that Brian pointed out in the sermon where he's patiently waiting for just one more. Just one more. If you were going to have more children, you might need to add another room on your house. Some of us would have to do that. It's a common thing. And someday we're going to be with him. Thank you.